So good morning, I'm Desmond King, one of the two discussants on this panel, or on this paper. Dan Tichenor is the other one. We're both APD scholars, American Political Development, so that puts us at a handicap discussing this paper. However, we'll do our best. So Martin and Pia have presented an excellent, richly detailed account of the way US immigration laws evolved in the 20th century, and in particular, the various reforms initiated since the 1986 overhaul. They're careful and scrupulous in presenting key data numbers about immigration, calibrated descriptions of the categories of immigrants, present a useful fourfold periodization of immigration in the US since it began, and offer some remarks about integration and Trump. Their descriptive framework finds three types of immigrants: front door entrants, properly dressed for dinner, bringing the requisite gift of a bottle of good claret; side door entrants, often friends of the front door guests, though always standing dutifully behind them and not usually providing such a generous gift, as some of them do. And then the back door entrance, in reality slipping through cracks in the door hinges rather than the main door frame, and bearing no gifts other than brawn. All this detailed narrative is accomplished to a high standard in the chapter, as I think you got a taste from the presentations from Martin and Pia. Although historically informed, the chapter is quite atheoretical and treats immigration as a single, largely self-contained policy area. But as authors, they seem to have utterly ignored the advice of their editor, Jim Holyfield, who said not to see immigration as a self-contained policy area. I think you said that this morning. You will need to speak to your contributors here. Good luck sorting out these differences. For political scientists, of which I'm afraid I'm one, notably those employing APD, immigration is part of how the US polity was and is constituted, and a source of enduring divisions in the political system. From its inception, American political development and its effect on immigration policy has been dominated by the country's racial divisions, and is really only explicable for a lot of APD scholars by taking account of those things, the way Catholicism made Irish black, so-called, the wages of whiteness, and so forth. The common place with which the chapter opens, the first sentence is "a nation of immigrants," reifies the long-standing failure to recognize how kidnapping and involuntary transportation defined America's state immigration policy. And these effects are enduring and continuing. Are there any African Americans on the faculty in either the economics or agricultural economics departments at UC Davis? There's one, okay, not listed on the website. The same is true of political science. There are no tenured African Americans and never have been in the political science department at Berkeley. And many baby boomers aren't retiring, so we're not going to see vacancies in the short term. So the legacy of this system of immigration and the way it operated racially is deep and profound. And how else could President Trump have so successfully orchestrated and exploited the image of dangerous migrants in his presidential campaign without widespread cultural motifs to which he could appeal, cultural motifs about foreigners? But the notion of foreigner is not just towards the external threat, but also internal in the US, as the title of Arlie Hochschilder's runaway bestseller captures, Strangers in Our Land, or Kramer's book about the politically resentful who live in Wisconsin. The object of their ire is African Americans and migrants. American immigration policy can't really be separated from its racial ethnic orders, as I explain in a book called Making Americans that Jim helpfully cites in his opening chapter, so you'll find it there. And the historical treatment of immigrants is often more aggressive than implied, I think, by this chapter. And that's what worries me about the chapter, and that's what I would want to bring in more. The nation of immigrants, as you call it, is paradoxically often one of exclusion and enforcement. Now, I don't want to go on for too long because we're behind on time, so I'm drawing on work I do with Roger Smith, a scholar at Penn, who's now currently president of the APSA. We've written a lot about what we call racial orders in America and how much they've structured different policies. What I want to argue is that, and I'll talk about Trump because you didn't understandably want to say that much about him. What I think Trump's immigration policies are about is restoring what they see as a white dominance in America. And there's a whole agenda and program of rolling back civil rights, affecting welfare policy, voting rights, and so forth, of which immigration policy is a part. And the way in which he used it in the election is extremely important. I mean, you just have to spend some time on his rhetoric to get a sense of this. We've done a close analysis of all his campaign speeches, which finds two central themes. He presents the nation's past as unequivocally great, marginalizing any acknowledgement of past, much less present, racial discrimination or white supremacist traditions. Second, Trump portrays most Americans today as unjustly threatened by the secular globalist policies of corrupt elites who aid opponents of Americanism, many with foreign origins and strange religious beliefs, while disadvantaging those he depicts as most committed to American values, especially Christians. Cleverly repurposing liberal multicultural themes, Trump insists that these lovers of America deserve to have their identities as protected, at least equally to that of other identity groups, if not more so, since the US government has a duty to put Americans first. The policies he's pursued have tried to do this as well, and I single out, just to give you some policies in immigration policy, and some of these are in your paper and some aren't. He has officials who criticize the 1965 reform, which ended national origin quotas for immigration, and he has made many casual comments about where he'd like immigrants to come from. It's not Africa, to give you a clue. He's imposed travel bans on predominantly Muslim nations, which the court basically pretty well upheld. Interestingly enough, I mean, there's a notion that these things will not get through, but it did. He's imposed case quotas for immigration judges to facilitate deportations. He pardoned the Arizona County Sheriff, Joe Arpaio. He rescinded the DACA program. He's curbed grants to sanctuary cities with threats of further sanctions. Terminated and you do mention this in your chapter, he's terminated the temporary protected status which Nicaraguans, Haitians, Salvadorians, Nepalese, and Hondurans have had in the US. He terminated eligibility of Haitians for H-2A and H-2B visas. He's created a denaturalization task force to investigate fraudulent naturalizations, that is, people who've become American citizens if something emerges about them. And he's deployed military troops to the border to prevent the caravans. He shut down the government, declaring a national emergency, and transferred funds to try to construct the wall. He's imposed fees and other new requirements on asylum seekers. And he's considered reduction in overall immigration levels, celebrating the point system as a point that Christian made earlier as well. So there's quite a lot of things that have gone on here which don't make much sense on their own, and I entirely agree that immigration policy has to be seen as part of a more general set of strategies and measures. And I think they're very much part of the, and Rogers and I say this in our paper, very much part of the effort to restore some mythical image of the US. And this has given sort of traction and further mobilization to the distinct white identity politics in the US, something that's really revived. So a study published in 2011 found that while black and white Americans believed anti-black bias had declined, many whites thought anti-white bias had been rising through the decades. By 2017, one survey found that 55% of whites believe that whites suffer discrimination in modern America, more so than African Americans. Those who view whites as discriminated against often cite race-conscious policies, especially in employment and education, as examples of this bias, and want to have colorblind policies in that process. They often oppose even facially neutral policies that are intended chiefly to aid non-whites. And there are lots of other factors around this which I think are important. There's a very interesting book by a political scientist that just came out, Ashley Jardina at Duke, called White Identity Politics. I think it's Cambridge Press 2019 this year. And it's based on her PhD at the University of Michigan, where she did an analysis of public opinion data to see if there was a distinct group, a distinct white identity coming into play in America at the moment. Now, her data didn't permit her to study the construction of white identities over time, but she does posit that politicians can activate white identity by drawing attention to potential threats to white status and campaigning to protect that status. Jardina concludes that more than any other politician in 2016, Trump took positions on immigration and other issues like crime, social security, that powerfully appealed to white identifiers to the point of signaling an attempt to maintain the racial hierarchy. So Trump's rhetoric and policies show that under his leadership, the modern conservative, putatively colorblind policy alliance has more clearly come to operate as a white protectionist policy alliance in ways that deepen American experiences of racial divisions. The administration's immigration policies are consistent with this strategy, and I would argue need to be combined analytically with what you have in the chapter. Some small points, and then I'll stop. You say that Trump's intervention means, quote, migration has become much more partisan. You say this on page 23, which I entirely agree with, but what you don't really point out is how partisan division is now fundamentally racial division. Read Michael Tesler's post-racial book about this. Republicans are fully colorblind supporters who are anti-federal activism to address racial inequality, whereas Democrats are race-conscious and want to use federal activism for civil rights. In previous periods, in the periods of your first three periodizations, there were internal divisions in the parties about these issues. There aren't anymore. And Trump has deepened this partisan racial fault line. Now, just Pia, from the second half of the presentation, just referred on page 29, the authors ask, why doesn't immigration have a more negative effect on US workers? And we got a very nice analysis from Pia. I find it a bit odd you didn't disaggregate this question by racial and ethnic categories in order to sort of get at this more, in a more calibrated way. It seems to be quite important. I think you'll conclude your section on immigration integration should either go or really be repaired. This is the 3 pages, pages 33 to 36. You don't say who proposes the different models. The term Americanized is used without any thought about its historical and ideological overtones, which are intense. It was a very important thing in the First World War, and this is why Germans don't stop identifying and so forth as American. Lastly, you end up rather curiously, page 38, 39, talking about the system as broken, which seems to me really quite inconsistent with the celebratory tone of a lot of the chapter, and especially that opening sentence, the US is a nation of immigrants. Can it be both a nation of immigrants and manifest as a broken system at the same time? How do the authors reconcile these two views and connect them to the, what's it called, the gap? The immigration gap that Jim set out there. Thanks very much.
Still morning, so good morning. I'm Dan Tichenor, and I'm actually a former student of Jim Hollifield, so I got started in this business. You can tell by the gray hair, many years ago. He was a wonderful, generous mentor. Thank you, Jim and François, for organizing this conference for us. I think where I'd like to start, like Des, I agree that this chapter by Martin and Arrhenius really does a nice job of setting some broad contours about patterns of migration, patterns of integration, and so forth over time. I'm going to talk about my main commentary in a moment. I'm going to start with 3 brief quibbles. Since you guys take seriously the history of this story, the first would be to urge you to tell in your chapter a much richer account of the narrative of undocumented immigration in the United States over time. So, looking at people like Mae Nye and others, I think for a more textured version of this. Likewise, I would encourage a deeper treatment of assimilation integration issues and digging into things like segmented assimilation, so whether you want the Min-Zhao version of that, distinguishing between those who are high skilled and educated versus lower skilled, less educated, and their experiences being quite different. Or you could look at wonderful work by Sibel Fox in 3 Worlds of Relief, which gives you a different vision of this. And a third very quick thing to mention is, what would be your account or model of change? So, for instance, Phil spent some time, I think, very nicely talking about California in the 1990s. We had a bit of flashback to the eras of Governor Pete Wilson, who vilified undocumented immigrants to propel his own political future. Well, California, as Phil points out quite aptly, barely resembles that now. California is the sanctuary state. It is the state that champions immigrant rights. And so for a model of change, I'd wonder, what do you all think about a state like Arizona, for instance, which in some ways could be described as the old California, famous for passing a legislation that was very similar to Prop 187, and a Show Me Your Papers law that was quite draconian in its treatment of immigrants. And fast forward, and in the most, while most people were focusing at the top of the election results in 2016, a really powerful data point in Arizona was in Maricopa County, which was once kind of the heart of nativism in California. Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who Des just mentioned a moment ago, sort of the kind of key demagogue on this, on kind of nativism in the United States, was defeated as sheriff in Maricopa County by large margins. A result reaffirmed by the purpling, that is the kind of shift toward Democratic votes in Arizona in the last midterm election. So accounts of change. What happened in California? Is Arizona heading that direction? And so forth. Okay, but all that is a diversion from what I really want to talk about, which is, and I'm going to try to be very brief, is my commentary is primarily focused on 4 main points. The first is actually straight from what Dr. King was talking about. That is, to really understand and unpack the persistent allure of white nationalism and xenophobic nationalism in the United States. That is, that nativism, race-based nativism, has been such a powerful fixture in American politics over time and continues to have significant political purchase. And in fact, one of the things that I think would be terrific is if in your chapter you could, since you're doing a lot of historical work there, is connect the dots from the past to Trump, because it is not one that emerged brand new with Donald Trump's nativist campaigns in 2016, far from it. And it has a very recent past and has a very long past that I think would be useful to tell. And I have much more to say on this, but I would say for now, just see Desmond King's comments a moment ago. So, point 2 is that, in fact, these nativists and white supremacists in the US experience have hardly commanded the whole field. In fact, you've always seen an array of competing interests and ideologies at war with each other surrounding US immigration policymaking, both today and in the past. And since Gary Freeman has been, my friend Gary Freeman has been invoked today, I would emphasize that in his famous formulation on these questions, that public opinion, at least in the United States, has changed rather dramatically from the set assumptions that he had. That is, whether you want to look at support for legalization, which was quite controversial in 1986, or indicators like, do you support more immigration or keeping robust levels the same or want decreased? You've seen some marked changes towards a more pro-immigrant perspective from a majority of Americans. There's still a very powerful minority who hold diametrically opposed perspectives on this. But to be clear, the baseline assumptions of the Freeman approach are, in terms of public opinion, are really not the same. And in fairness to Gary, of course, I think lots has changed since the 1990s, but it's important to underscore that because I think it helps capture the amount of ideological churn and difference and the powerful competing interests that are surrounding this question. Another classic example of this is the vaunted master of all trades for the Trump administration, Jared Kushner. Appeared before Congress recently to provide a comprehensive immigration reform proposal, and it was dead on arrival. Not just from Democrats, but from Republicans who shot it down, pro-business Republicans and so forth. So 2 other quick examples of this is the Muslim ban that was mentioned a few moments ago when Donald Trump issues this by executive order. The amount of tumult and mobilization in airports at the grassroots kind of captures again the divisions surrounding this question, or as Phil was talking about, the family separation policy, one of the most draconian that I can think of in my lifetime in the US surrounding immigrants, where children were being ripped from their parents, and still are in what could be described as modern concentration camps, actually, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic about that in the least. the amount of pushback on this, again, captures these rival interests. So in my commentary, if you want a good cure for insomnia, if any of you are suffering from jet lag, turn to page 3 or 4. I spent some time unpacking a variety of contending interests and ideological traditions surrounding this question. So so here's the third point. These conflicts, these regular, prolonged conflicts over immigration in the United States has the effect of making immigration reform incredibly difficult. And so basically, we are constantly in the United States in a mode of waiting for reform that can take decades. There's tons of stalemate. And when you finally get some breakthrough on this policy front, it often requires, as Aristide Zolberg described it, strange bedfellows to get together, left-right coalitions. But it's actually even much more complicated than that, because that gives you a sense of a bifurcation. There's usually, Phil referred to the three-legged stool. We could, depending on certain reforms, you could talk about 4 or 5 main groups that are at it. And the punchline for this is that what you end up with in the reforms are a set of very conflicting elements in each stage of this policy change. Final point, which was I was happy to hear in Phil's presentation, something that I did not find in the chapter, which was to think about the different structural and institutional components of immigration policy change and policy making in a much more variegated way than you get in the chapter. The chapter places a huge emphasis on Congress. Congress, as I'm mentioning, a kind of stalemate, has been gridlocked for more than a quarter century in terms of immigration reform. And to fill that vacuum, you've seen a dramatic increase in executive unilateralism. So those who are political scientists have often heard, at least in the US case, that we've moved from questions about the democratic deficit to questions about constitutional dictatorship. Or maybe the constitutional part of that might be being too kind. Maybe it's just plain dictatorship that we're worried about. And not just during the Trump years, but what's striking is with immigration policy making is the extent to which executive unilateralism was so crucial in the George W. Bush years, the Barack Obama years, and the Donald Trump years. Likewise, filling this void are states. That is federalism in the US, where you have a variety of states cutting in lots of different directions on these questions. And finally, the courts coming in to try to arbitrate these things in various ways, both in terms of autonomous executive activity, as well as states and whether what they're doing is constitutional. So let me just sum up by saying that, and here I think I share and appreciate a lot of Christian's comments surrounding the gap hypothesis. So at the chapter tries to delineate a gap between the goals and outcomes of U.S. immigration policies, which may not be very hard. As Jim pointed out today, there's always unintended consequences, right? If we had, Leo's in the room, but most historians would tell us we would expect that there will always be this kind of gap, so it should be very easy to identify. Yet, at least in the U.S. case, the devil lies precisely in specifying the goals of U.S. immigration policies, present or past. That is, immigration reforms have typically codified rival and incongruous goals in the same legislation. So surprisingly, I don't have time to do this, I do this in my paper a little bit, but surprisingly, things like the National Origin Quota Acts of the 1920s included lots of draconian restrictions, both in terms of how they tried to control the composition of immigrants and the quantity, but they also involved very clear compromises with powerful agricultural growers in the United States at the time, saying, well, make sure, since we're talking about doors a lot as a metaphor, that the back door to cheap, exploitable Mexican labor would be left open, okay? So you have, the headline from the 1920s was restrictions, and yet you also had these openings because of the kind of coalition that was that needed to stitch together. Take the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Some would hail it as a dismantling of the national origins quota system, and so in fact, this triumph of a more inclusive vision, but as many of you know, there's the other side of the story too. Placing ceilings on Western Hemisphere immigration, the intent was in fact with family ties, was to encourage European immigration, had the unintended consequence of bringing in lots of Latin Americans and Asians. Likewise, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, I could also discuss lots of incongruous, conflicting elements within it, but I won't. So let me just say, in conclusion, that the profusion of competing policy goals in the US context, both over time and at any given time, make a cogent articulation of the gap hypothesis particularly elusive and maybe quixotic. Thank you.